Today we are going to look at revising poetry and what we need to do for that. So why do we revise poetry? Well, for one, your first draft is just that. It's your first try, is getting the words on the paper. Revision is where you try and make things better. You try to find the right words. You try to figure out how to have the biggest emotional impact possible. And you make sure that your poem makes sense and that it says what you want it to say. Powerful poetry uses vivid, specific, descriptive language, figurative and literal, instead of general or boring words. You look at how you can connect with and impact the audience's emotions, and it may require interpretation, but the message is clear. When you look at the words that you've chosen in terms of language, look at how precise they are, how descriptive they are. Is there a better word that describes what you're trying to say? Can you use something that is more descriptive? And also, are there any literary devices that you can use to emphasize what you're trying to portray? You don't want to include literary devices just for the purposes of including literary devices, but they can help improve your writing. We'll talk a little bit about literary devices at the end of this video. The other thing you really want to think about in terms of revision is your lines and your stanzas. The lines and stanza breaks can impact the visual appeal of the poem. Take a look at this first poem. Notice how beckons is on its own line, but all of the other lines are quite a bit longer. It makes the poem look a little unusual. The second poem changes some of the line lengths so that we have ones that are more similar in terms of length. They're not all the same length, but there isn't that drastic difference between beckons and all of the other lines. Finding the best line and stanza breaks, though, isn't just about the visual appeal. Where you put the break can emphasize different ideas or different words. Check out these three examples. The first is the second version from last time, but I've rewritten it in 3 different ways. I want you to listen to how I read these poems. For the first one, the blank page in front of me beckons, inviting my blood spilled in blue ink, so I can recreate myself in these pages. The second one, the blank page in front of me beckons, inviting my blood spilled in blue ink, so I can recreate myself in these pages. And then the third, the blank page in front of me beckons, inviting my blood spilled in blue ink, so I can recreate myself in these pages. Notice how my emphasis, the way I read the poem, is different depending on the different line breaks. This is one of the things that you want to look at as you are revising your poems. And you especially want to read the poems out loud to yourself a few different times to find the one that fits the best. I mentioned figurative language and literary devices earlier. Here's some examples, although there's certainly a lot more. In terms of sound elements that you can use, one of them is alliteration, which is a repeated sound at the beginning of a word in words that are close together. Peter proposed to Patricia. Onomatopoeia is a word that represents a sound sounding like the sound itself, like buzz, clap, meow. Rhyme we've talked about. It's a pattern of repeated sounds, either at the end of lines, which is called end rhyme, or within a line, which is called internal rhyme. Stronger than you know, stronger than you show. Know and show rhyme. And then there's rhythm, which is a pattern of stressed and unstressed words at equal intervals. There was a time when for many a day I lost myself in the wild frozen dark. You wouldn't say it like that if you were reading the poem normally, but there is that emphasis on specific syllables. Stressed, unstressed, unstressed. Stressed, unstressed, unstressed, and so on and so forth. In addition to literary devices that have to do with sound, there are other ones that have to do with visual elements. Imagery is one of the major ones. It's words and phrases which describe or relate to one or more of the 5 senses, and they let you picture or sense the meaning of the text or what the words are saying. An example of this is a pale blue sky with thready white clouds soars above you. You can picture that image. Metaphor is a comparison between two things that are not alike, but one that doesn't use like or as. An example, the sun is a lion leaping over the horizon. A simile is very much like a metaphor, except that it does use like and as. Love is like a flower in bloom, instead of love is a flower in bloom, which would be a metaphor. And then there are figures of speech, which they state something that isn't literally true in order to create an effect in the poem. Some examples of these are hyperbole, which is exaggeration for effect. I have 1,000 things to do. Verbal irony or sarcasm, where the literal dictionary definition of the words is different from what was meant. For example, when you tell your mother, "I would love to clean my room." And personification, which gives human characteristics to something that isn't human. The breeze caresses her hair. The breeze doesn't really have hands, so it's kind of hard for it to do that. One of the things that we keep going back to is that the writing that you do, any writing that you do, no matter how good you are or how much you struggle with it, it can be made better. Even published authors and poets look at books that they've published or that they've sold and are frustrated because they can see how they could have done better. Even with revision, the point isn't perfection. As you become a better writer, what was amazing for you in the past will actually not be very good. The point isn't to try and make your writing perfect. It's to look at your writing with a critical eye and figure out how to improve it, and then do that. I can't wait to see what you write. The next part of this video is going to show me revising the poem I wrote in the drafting stage for at least a first revision. This was the poem that I started with. Remember, I'd written one that was a little bit darker than the other. This is the darker poem. What I'm looking at here right now as I'm revising this, I've got this one scene that's described really well, or at least described more. The children's voices, screaming, laughing, cheering at the park. So there's this whole stanza that's really only dealing with one experience. And I felt like to really show the sense of solitude and isolation and silence, I needed more examples. So I brainstormed as many as I could think of, trying to find different places that were silent. I'm hesitating with the parks because, well, the children's voices at the park, at the school, there's some similarity there. So I'm not 100% sure that I want to go with that one as I'm writing this down. But I also don't want to just have 2 examples. Poetry needs to be concise. It needs to be focused. With poetry, you're looking for language and phrasing that pulls out images, but not harps on them too much. Prose you can use tons of words for. With poetry, you want to use the right ones. You want to use the most important ones, the most descriptive ones, and you want to cut everything else out. I'm really struggling with this part, with how to use imagery to paint a picture of another place. The park came pretty easily to me because it's something that was actually in my experience. Waking up on Sunday morning to kids screaming and air horns going off as everybody's playing soccer. But the other ones were harder to write. Coming up with other ones was harder to write because I kept trying to reach for these experiences that weren't necessarily ones that really stood out for me. So I had to do a lot of brainstorming and a lot of kind of testing things out. I'm really hesitating over this one because I wanted to make it clear that, the classrooms, the physical classrooms, may not be full of learning, but school's still going on. So I was kind of going back and forth. I wasn't really sure that, although what I was saying was true, that it contributed to the message I was trying to send. It all ends was awfully imprecise. Noise returns to the world was more specific, but also kind of wordy, and it didn't really get at that whole negative sense that the poem had. So I went with this one because I liked that image of broken, particularly when I was talking about how the solitude shapes someone. After I've written a draft and I've kind of messed it up, writing all over it as I revise it, I find it really important to rewrite it, to have a clear second draft copy. As I'm rewriting it, often I'll still make some changes. I'm hesitating here because I'm using break bread, and that seems really archaic, really old. But at the same point, it gives this sense of community that I want. So I hesitated, but I went with that, at least for now. I think I mentioned this before, I'm very fond of threes in my poetry. So I've got this parallel structure, 3 stanzas that start all "there is silence." I'm still not 100% sure about this one, but eventually I left it and moved forward. And I've got some different images as well. There's the park one in the first stanza, and then the table in the second, and classrooms in the third. I changed this a little bit from the revisions that I was doing earlier. And I did that because I wanted to emphasize the narrator in this. I am here. Originally, I'd written, within these 4 walls, I am safe. But I wanted to start with the narrator in this stanza. I've got these sort of situational descriptions in the first 3 stanzas. And then in this one, it's looking at the narrator's point of view, the narrator's perspective. I've indented this line because I feel that it visually connects the idea of pressing down to the actual words. And this is where I'd really struggled with how I was going to end the poem, because the ending's one of the most important parts. The ending is often where your message really comes through. So instead of going with a passive statement, when the silence is broken, I wanted to go with a more active one, when the silence breaks. I want to show you the revision process for the second poem, the one that's a little happier, but I'm going to move through it a lot faster because most of what I said in terms of teaching you how to revise, it's happening here as well. I'm looking at line breaks, I'm looking at stanza breaks, I'm trying to find words that are stronger ones. I chose to change stay back to hesitate because it's hesitate, hide away, and hold still. So if I could do that, I've got that alliteration going on, which I thought was good, was better. I changed this to make it a little more poetic, a little more visual, wilder, maybe. I really struggled with, should I use imagination or should I use imaginings? I liked imaginings because it was a verb, so it was an action, whereas imagination's a noun, so it was a thing. Come true was pretty trite, dreams come true, pretty boring, so I wanted something that was a little more visual and that involved more of a metaphor. And then, like before, I rewrite the poem. You can't actually see what I'm writing up at the top here because I didn't move the thing down. But the first few lines are, "Our life is made beautiful in the living. We are not made to hesitate." And then you're in there to hold still, to hide away. I'm hesitating here and I'm making a note that I want to go back and I want to try and find something that's going to be one word instead of reach for the brightest star, because I've got climb the highest mountain and I want that parallel structure. But it's late and I'm having a hard time coming up with the right word. So I made a note and I'll look at that in my next revision. And then I title all of my poetry. So this one is, at least for now, Dream Fiercely.